December 11, 1941. Foreign Ministry, Wilhelmstrasse, Berlin. Leland B. Morris's hand trembled slightly as Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop extended the document across the mahogany desk. Morris, American chargé d'affaires in Nazi Germany, serving in the absence of Ambassador William Dodd, had been summoned to Ribbentrop's office at precisely 2:30 in the afternoon, German time. The summons itself had been delivered with unusual formality, even by the rigid standards of Nazi bureaucracy. This cannot be what I think it is. Roosevelt deliberately excluded Germany from the December 8th declaration. There's been no incident, no provocation beyond what's already occurred. The document bore the official seal of the German Reich. Morris scanned the opening lines. The government of the United States having violated in the most flagrant manner and in ever-increasing measure all rules of neutrality. It was a declaration of war. Morris looked up at Ribbentrop. The foreign minister's face was flushed, his eyes bright with something between triumph and anger. Germany was declaring war on the United States, not responding to an American declaration, but initiating it themselves. 4 days after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. 3 days after President Roosevelt had asked Congress to declare war on Japan, and only Japan. The implications crashed through Morris's mind like dominoes falling. Roosevelt had been unable to convince Congress to fight in Europe. The isolationists were still strong. The America First Committee had just issued a statement supporting war against Japan while pointedly making no reference to Europe. Germany had no treaty obligation to support Japan's attack. The Tripartite Pact promised assistance only if Japan was attacked first, not if Japan was the aggressor. And yet here was Ribbentrop practically shoving a declaration of war into his hands. George F. Kennan, first secretary at the embassy, and already in his 15th year of diplomatic service, would later describe the mood among American diplomats in Berlin in the days since Pearl Harbor as one of excruciating uncertainty. They had known war between Germany and America was likely inevitable, but they had not expected this. Hitler choosing the timing, solving Roosevelt's greatest political problem with a single catastrophic misjudgment. After Morris finished reading, Ribbentrop could contain himself no longer. He leaned forward, practically shouting, "Ihr Präsident hat diesen Krieg gewollt, jetzt hat ihn. Your president has wanted this war, now he has it." Then he turned on his heels and left the room, leaving Morris alone with the document that would transform a Pacific conflict into a truly global war. Morris glanced at his watch. 2:45 p.m. Berlin time, 8:45 in Washington. He needed to transmit this immediately. German diplomat Hans Thomsen would be delivering an identical declaration to Secretary of State Cordell Hull in Washington at precisely 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time, in just 15 minutes, assuming he hadn't already been delayed. The journey to this moment, Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States while German forces were locked in desperate winter combat at the gates of Moscow, while polls showed only 30% of Americans supported fighting in Europe, represented perhaps the most puzzling strategic decision of the entire Second World War. The journey to this revelation had begun exactly 4 years earlier, on December 11, 1937, when Italy withdrew from the League of Nations, signaling Benito Mussolini's growing alignment with Adolf Hitler's Germany. But the formal architecture of the Axis alliance took shape on September 27, 1940, when Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact in Berlin. The signing ceremony at the Reich Chancellery was elaborate, orchestrated with the characteristic pomposity of Nazi diplomacy. Joachim von Ribbentrop represented Germany. Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's son-in-law and foreign minister, signed for Italy, though he arrived 2 hours late, much to propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels' irritation. Sabuno Caruso signed for Japan. Adolf Hitler himself presided, proclaiming the pact as evidence of an unstoppable coalition that would dominate the world for the next 1,000 years. Article 3 of the Tripartite Pact contained the defensive alliance's critical language. The signatory powers agreed to assist one another with all political, economic, and military means when one of the three contracting powers is attacked by a power at present not involved in the European War or in the Sino-Japanese conflict. This wording was deliberate. It excluded the Soviet Union, already involved in both conflicts. The pact was aimed squarely at the United States, designed to deter American entry into the war by threatening a two-ocean conflict should the U.S. intervene. But the language was also carefully limited. The treaty promised assistance only if a signatory was attacked, not if a signatory was the aggressor. This distinction would prove crucial. The pact's practical effects were minimal from the beginning. Historian Paul W. Schroeder described it as declining from a position of importance in late 1940 to one of merely nominal existence in late 1941, and as virtually inoperative by December 1941. The Italo-German and Japanese operational theaters were on opposite sides of the planet. The signatories maintained disparate strategic interests. Japan wanted Germany to attack British positions in Asia. Germany wanted Japan to attack the Soviet Union in Siberia. Neither got what they wanted. Throughout 1941, Hitler had watched President Roosevelt with growing fury and frustration. The Lend-Lease Act, passed by Congress on March 11, 1941, authorized Roosevelt to lend or lease war materials to any nation vital to the defense of the United States. In practice, this meant billions of dollars in American tanks, aircraft, trucks, and ammunition flowing to Britain and, after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, to Stalin's Red Army as well. By any reasonable definition, America was supporting Germany's enemies. Then came the naval incidents. On September 4, 1941, the destroyer USS Greer exchanged fire with a German U-boat. The Greer was depth-charging a submarine that had already been spotted and bombed by a British aircraft. German submarine commander Kapitänleutnant Georg Werner Fratz fired 2 torpedoes in self-defense, both of which missed. Roosevelt used the incident to issue his shoot-on-sight order. American naval forces would fire on any Axis warship found in waters necessary for American defense. On October 17, 1941, the destroyer USS Kearney was torpedoed while escorting convoy HX-156. The torpedo struck her starboard side, killing 11 sailors and wounding 22. The Kearney, commissioned in 1940, survived and limped back to port. Roosevelt delivered a sharp address condemning the attack, though he stopped short of asking for war. Then, on October 31, 1941, barely 5 weeks before Pearl Harbor, came the USS Reuben James. The Reuben James was a Clemson-class destroyer, one of the 4 stackers built in the rush of World War I ship construction. At dawn on October 31, she was escorting convoy HX-156 roughly 600 miles west of Ireland. Her commander was Lieutenant Commander Haywood L. Tex Edwards, a 35-year-old 1926 Naval Academy graduate and member of the 1928 U.S. Olympic wrestling team. The destroyer's crew of 7 officers and 136 enlisted men, plus 1 enlisted passenger, was on alert for U-boats. At 5:34 in the morning, German submarine U-552, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Erich Topp and bearing a painted red devil on her conning tower, fired a spread of 2 torpedoes. Topp had been targeting merchant vessels. The Reuben James had positioned herself between an ammunition ship and the known location of a German wolf pack. When Topp's executive officer pointed out the convoy on the horizon, the captain selected his targets. He was looking through his periscope when he saw with horror that the American destroyer was turning directly into the path of his torpedoes. One torpedo struck the Reuben James on her port side. The forward magazine exploded. The blast tore the destroyer's bow completely off. The forward section sank immediately with all hands. The aft section remained afloat for 5 minutes before sliding beneath the waves. As it sank, unsecured depth charges detonated, killing survivors struggling in the frigid water. Of the 144 men aboard, 100 died, including all 7 officers. Commander Edwards and his entire command staff perished. Only 44 enlisted men survived. None had radar. All they'd had, as torpedoman Robert Howard recalled, was a pair of binoculars and a rubber ear to press against the skin of the ship to listen for screw noises. The sinking of the Reuben James marked the first U.S. warship lost to hostile action in the Atlantic. Yet it did not produce the rallying cry that might have been expected. 43 years earlier, the destruction of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor had led to war with Spain within months. But in October 1941, as the New York Times observed, the people, their representatives in Congress, and even many high officials of the government are deeply divided on the subject. Navy enlistments actually declined 15% in November. Roosevelt did not break diplomatic relations with Germany. He stayed away from the bellicose rhetoric he'd used after earlier incidents. The reason was simple. Roosevelt knew he couldn't get a declaration of war through Congress. Not against Germany, not in Europe. Throughout 1941, Hitler had maintained a careful strategy regarding the United States. Provoke just enough to demonstrate strength, but not enough to force Roosevelt's hand. The calculus was delicate. Germany needed to demonstrate it would not be intimidated by American naval escorts protecting British convoys. But Hitler also understood, or believed he understood, that Roosevelt lacked congressional support for war in Europe. This pattern repeated across multiple incidents. German submarines attacked American destroyers with increasing frequency. U-boats sank American-flagged merchant vessels. On December 19, 1939, the American cruiser Tuscaloosa had maneuvered the German passenger liner Columbus into British hands, forcing Germany to scuttle the ship. On January 27, 1940, the cruiser Trenton reported movements of German merchant ships Arauca, La Plata, and Wangoni to British naval forces. Roosevelt protested German actions, but took no substantive steps toward war. The America First Committee, the most influential anti-interventionist organization in the country, commanded massive support. Founded by Yale law student R. Douglas Stewart, Jr., the committee boasted some 800,000 members at its height. Its national spokesman was aviation hero Charles Lindbergh. Its membership included future President Gerald Ford, future Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart, and future Peace Corps Director Sergeant Shriver. The committee's position was clear and unwavering. Europe's wars were not America's concern. Even as German armies swept across France in 1940, even as the Luftwaffe bombed British cities during the Blitz, even as U-boats sent Allied ships to the bottom of the Atlantic at a horrific pace, the America First Committee maintained that American entry into the war would be catastrophic folly. Public opinion polls supported their position. As late as October 1941, barely 2 months before Pearl Harbor, only 30% of Americans supported U.S. entry into the war against Germany. 70% opposed it. These numbers had barely moved despite 2 years of increasingly obvious Nazi aggression. Roosevelt understood the political reality. At a White House conference on the night of December 7, immediately after Pearl Harbor, the president and his advisors agreed that, in the last analysis, the enemy is Hitler. Germany, not Japan,
posed the true existential threat to American interests and democratic civilization. But when Roosevelt addressed Congress on December 8th, requesting a declaration of war, he spoke only of Japan. He made no mention of Germany, no mention of Italy, no mention of the European war at all. The President's December 8th speech, the Day of Infamy address, consumed 6 minutes and 30 seconds. Congress responded with a war declaration that passed 82-0 in the Senate and 388-1 in the House. The lone dissenter was Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a pacifist who had also voted against U.S. entry into World War I. But the declaration mentioned only Japan. Roosevelt's December 9 fireside chat went further. He told Americans that Japan's path to war was more than just a parallel path to those of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. It is actual collaboration, so well calculated that all the continents of the world and all the oceans are now considered by the Axis strategists as one gigantic battlefield. He was trying to connect the dots for the American people, explaining that Pearl Harbor was part of a broader Axis conspiracy that included Germany. But even after these public statements, Roosevelt remained acutely conscious, as historians note, of massive anti-war sentiment. He could not ask Congress for war against Germany. The votes weren't there. The America First Committee understood this. In their statement issued on December 8th, one day after Pearl Harbor, they supported war against Japan, but made pointed reference to the European conflict. Robert Stewart's circular to chapter chairmen stated explicitly that the facts and arguments against intervention in Europe remain the same as they were before the Japanese issue arose. Germany, in other words, had a clear path forward. Hitler could refuse to support Japan's attack, point to the language of the Tripartite Pact absolving Germany of any obligation when Japan was the aggressor, and force Roosevelt to fight a Pacific-only war while Germany consolidated its position in Europe and continued the desperate attempt to defeat the Soviet Union. That, by any conventional strategic calculation, was the obvious choice.
Berlin, December 7, 11, 1941. When news of the Pearl Harbor attack reached Hitler's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the Führer was preoccupied with catastrophe. The German offensive against Moscow had permanently stalled on December 2nd, mere 5 miles from the Kremlin. German soldiers lacked winter clothing. Hitler had promised a quick summer victory. Temperatures on the Eastern Front had plummeted to 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Motor oil thickened to the consistency of caramel. Tanks and trucks were immobilized. German casualties were staggering. The news from the Eastern Front, that Pearl Harbor Sunday, was, in the words of one historian, catastrophic. German Field Marshal Fedor von Bock's Army Group Center had suffered massive losses. Soviet counterattacks were gaining momentum. The German people had yet to be informed that their Führer had grossly miscalculated. Hitler had received no advance notice from Japan about the Pearl Harbor attack. Although he and Ribbentrop had verbally indicated willingness to join Japan in war against America, Hitler had no formal treaty obligation to declare war on the United States. Such a treaty had been drafted and circulated in the weeks before Pearl Harbor, but it remained unsigned. For 3 days, Hitler consulted with his closest advisors. Ribbentrop urged immediate action. Hermann Göring, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, supported the declaration. The two men shared Hitler's assessment of American military capability. It was negligible. Both dismissed American industrial power. Göring had told Hitler repeatedly that the United States produced nothing but refrigerators and automobiles, consumer goods that could not quickly convert to weapons of war. The conventional strategic analysis was clear. Hitler should wait. Let Roosevelt struggle with Congress. Let America focus on Japan. Continue the fight against the Soviet Union without adding another enemy.
Germany's hands were full. The British were regaining ground in North Africa. Soviet resistance was far fiercer than anticipated. The last thing Germany needed was to provide Roosevelt with the political justification he desperately needed to enter the European war. But Hitler's reasoning operated on a different plane. As he confided to the Japanese ambassador, one should strike as hard as possible and not waste time declaring war. He believed war with America was inevitable. He believed Roosevelt was bent on Germany's destruction. He believed Japan was immensely powerful, that once Japan defeated the United States in the Pacific, it would turn to help Germany defeat the Soviet Union. Most critically, he completely underestimated American industrial capacity. On the morning of December 11, 1941, Hitler's decision was made. At 3 p.m., he would address the 855 deputies of the Reichstag gathered in the Kroll Opera House. He would deliver an 88-minute speech justifying his declaration of war. And he would announce that Germany was joining Japan in combat against the United States. The speech Hitler delivered that afternoon was a rambling tirade that mixed grievances, accusations, boasts, and threats. Much of it was devoted to vilifying President Franklin D. Roosevelt as a plutocrat, failed political leader, warmonger, hypocrite, insane individual, and pawn of the eternal Jew, according to historian Mark Weber. Hitler recounted every perceived American provocation: the maneuvering of the Columbus into British hands, the reporting of German merchant ship movements to enemy forces, the Lend-Lease Act, Roosevelt's September 11, 1941 shoot-on-sight order, the attacks by the Greer, Kearney, and Reuben James. Hitler's conclusion was ominous and revealing. Ultimate blame for World War, he declared, rested with the Jewish race, and the only answer was their annihilation. Historian Klaus P. Fischer argues that in December 1941, Hitler crossed the line separating a brutal dictator from a mass murderer. The declaration of war against the United States removed the final constraint on the systematic murder of European Jewry. Throughout autumn 1941, Hitler had repeatedly connected U.S. policy with the fate of European Jews, warning that Jews would be held responsible for American intervention. On October 25, he had refused Alfred Rosenberg's request for retaliation against German Jews for Stalin's deportation of Volga Germans, stating that the Führer was holding back this measure for the event of an American entry into the war. While Hitler spoke in Berlin, an unusual drama played out in Rome. Benito Mussolini, unwilling to let Hitler steal the spotlight, preempted the Führer's announcement.
At 2:45 p.m., 15 minutes before Hitler began speaking, Mussolini appeared on the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia and declared Italy's war against the United States to a crowd estimated at 100,000. His speech lasted 4 minutes. He denounced Roosevelt as an authentic and democratic despot whose diabolical pertinacity was responsible for war. Italian Foreign Minister Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's son-in-law, had summoned American Charge A George Wadsworth to his office at 2:30 p.m. Wadsworth, whom Ciano described in his diary as a good man, somewhat timid, arrived expecting to discuss the status of American journalists in Italy. Instead, Ciano handed him Italy's declaration of war. Wadsworth turned pale. His only response, "It is very tragic." In Washington, the German declaration arrived at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time, delivered by Hans Thomson to the State Department. Secretary of State Cordell Hull refused to see the German delegation. It was not until 9:30 a.m. that they were able to pass their note to Ray Atherton, head of the Division of European Affairs. The declaration's language echoed Hitler's speech. The government of the United States, having violated in the most flagrant manner and in ever-increasing measure all rules of neutrality in favor of the adversaries of Germany, and having continually been guilty of the most severe provocations toward Germany ever since the outbreak of the European War,
The German government discontinues diplomatic relations with the United States of America and declares that, under these circumstances brought about by President Roosevelt, Germany, too, as from today, considers herself as being in a state of war with the United States of America. Roosevelt had been informed within minutes. He moved with characteristic decisiveness. By mid-morning, he had drafted a brief message to Congress requesting declarations of war against Germany and Italy. The message was simple and direct. The forces endeavoring to enslave the entire world now are moving toward this hemisphere. Rapid and united effort by all of the peoples of the world who are determined to remain free will ensure a world victory of the forces of justice and of righteousness over the forces of savagery and of barbarism. Congress received Roosevelt's message at noon on December 11. The response was overwhelming. The House of Representatives voted 393-0 to declare war on Germany. Minutes later, they voted 399-0 to declare war on Italy. The Senate followed suit unanimously. Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin, who had voted against war with Japan, voted present rather than no, a parliamentary maneuver that registered her pacifist objection without technically opposing the declarations. The total time from Roosevelt's request to final congressional approval, 6 hours. John Kenneth Galbraith, Roosevelt's economic advisor, was at the White House when news of Hitler's declaration arrived. He later recalled experiencing an indescribable feeling of triumph upon hearing the announcement from Berlin. "I think it saved Europe," Galbraith said. Roosevelt had been handed the war authorization he desperately needed, delivered not by his own political maneuvering, but by the enemy himself. Winston Churchill, informed of Hitler's decision while at Chequers, experienced similar elation. In his Memoirs, he wrote, "So we had won after all." He went to bed that night and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. The strategic miscalculation was complete. Hitler had solved Roosevelt's greatest political problem. The isolationists were immediately silenced. The America First Committee would officially disband on December 11. Congress, which would never have approved a war declaration against Germany on Roosevelt's request alone, had done so unanimously. And the full industrial might of the United States, which Hitler had so catastrophically underestimated, would now be directed against Nazi Germany. To understand Hitler's decision, one must understand how completely he misread both American political reality and American industrial capacity. The misunderstanding was not accidental. It emerged from fundamental assumptions about democracy, capitalism, industrial production, and racial capability that formed the core of Nazi ideology. Hitler's view of American military potential was shaped by World War I experience. Germany had fought the American Expeditionary Force for barely 6 months in 1918 before the armistice. While American forces performed credibly, they relied almost entirely on French and British equipment. American industry had failed to deliver in quantity. Of the 2,250 artillery pieces used by American forces, only 130 were American-made. American pilots flew French aircraft. American tanks were French or British. This historical experience reinforced Hitler's racial theories. He viewed Americans as a mongrel population, half Judaized, half nigrified, incapable of matching the fighting qualities or industrial efficiency of racially pure Germans. Hermann Göring shared this assessment. When shown production estimates for American aircraft manufacturing, Göring dismissed them as propaganda. "The Americans can't build planes," he told Hitler, "only cars and refrigerators." The mathematics underlying Hitler's reasoning seemed compelling at first glance. In 1941, Germany controlled a population of approximately 170 million across the Greater German Reich and occupied territories. This included Germany itself, Austria, the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, northern France, and significant portions of the Soviet Union. The United States population in 1940 was 132 million. Germany, Hitler believed, would match American production with greater efficiency. But the calculation ignored critical factors. First, much of the territory Germany controlled was hostile, requiring substantial occupation forces. Second, Germany's industrial base was already stretched to capacity, supporting 3 simultaneous conflicts: the Battle of Britain, the North African Campaign, and the Eastern Front. Third, and most critically, Hitler failed to grasp the magnitude of American industrial capability. Consider the numbers. In 1939, before serious war mobilization, American automobile manufacturers produced 3.3 million cars annually. The Ford Motor Company's assembly lines built one complete automobile comprising 15,000 individual parts every 69 seconds. American steel production in 1939 totaled 81 million tons annually. American shipyards operated far below capacity. American aircraft plants produced primarily civilian aircraft. When America entered the war in December 1941, this massive civilian industrial infrastructure pivoted to war production with stunning speed. Automobile production dropped from more than 3 million cars in 1941 to just 223,000 in 1942 and only 139 in 1943. But this wasn't economic collapse, it was conversion. Ford's vast Willow Run plant in Ypsilanti, Michigan, the largest factory building ever constructed, began producing B-24 Liberator bombers. A car had 15,000 parts. A B-24 Liberator had 1,500,000 parts. At peak production, Willow Run built one complete bomber every 63 minutes. General Motors converted to producing aircraft engines, guns, trucks, and tanks. Chrysler manufactured fuselages. Packard built Rolls-Royce engines under license for the Royal Air Force. Steel mills ran 3 shifts daily, increasing rated capacity from 81 million tons in 1939 to 93 million tons by the end of 1942, reaching 98 million tons by mid-1943. Roosevelt had set ambitious goals for 1942: 60,000 aircraft, 45,000 tanks, and 8 million deadweight tons of merchant shipping. Many advisors thought these figures impossible, yet America met or exceeded them. By year's end, the United States had produced 49,000 aircraft, 32,000 tanks and self-propelled artillery pieces, and 8.2 million tons of merchant shipping. Most items, particularly aircraft, were larger and more complicated than those contemplated when goals were set. The disparity in total production was staggering. By war's end, American industry had produced approximately 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 to 102,000 tanks, sources vary, 2.7 million machine guns, 193,000 artillery pieces, and 2 million military trucks. American shipyards launched more vessels in 1941 alone than Japan produced during the entire war. In 1944, the United States built more planes than Japan built from 1939 to 1945. In the 3 years following Midway, Japan built 6 aircraft carriers, America 17. Hitler had built his decision on a fundamental misunderstanding.
He assumed American society, democratic, diverse, dominated by commercial interests, would lack the cohesion and discipline for total war mobilization. He was wrong. After Pearl Harbor, American society unified with remarkable speed. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers.
Rationing programs were accepted with minimal complaint. War bond drives raised billions. Factories ran around the clock. The Great Depression ended as unemployment dropped from 14.6% in 1940 to 1.9% by 1945. The strategic choice Hitler made on December 11, 1941, rested on three critical miscalculations. First, he believed Roosevelt would soon declare war on Germany regardless of the Tripartite Pact. This was wrong. Without German declaration, Roosevelt might never have obtained congressional approval for European war. Second, he believed Japan was immensely powerful and would defeat the United States in the Pacific, then join Germany against the Soviet Union. This was wrong. Japan's strategic position was already deteriorating. Pearl Harbor proved tactically brilliant, but strategically catastrophic. Third, he believed American industrial capacity was limited and American society lacked the will for total mobilization. This was wrong, catastrophically, definitively wrong. The decision to declare war on December 11, 1941, guaranteed Germany would face the combined industrial output of the United States, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union. It transformed a conflict Germany might conceivably have won into a war of attrition against an economically superior coalition that Germany could not possibly win.
The full weight of Hitler's miscalculation became apparent with remarkable speed. In Washington, the declaration of war triggered immediate strategic decisions that would determine the course of the conflict. On December 22, 1941, 11 days after Hitler's declaration, Winston Churchill arrived in Washington for the Arcadia Conference. For 3 weeks, Churchill and Roosevelt hammered out the fundamental strategy that would guide Allied operations: Germany first. Despite Pearl Harbor, despite Japanese advances across the Pacific, despite public pressure to focus on avenging the attack that brought America into the war, Roosevelt committed to making Nazi Germany the priority target. This decision was possible only because Hitler had declared war. Had America been fighting Japan alone, Roosevelt could not have justified diverting resources to Europe. The isolationists would have erupted. Congress would have demanded Pacific focus. But Hitler's declaration provided political cover for the strategy Roosevelt had wanted all along. The implications rippled across every theater of the war. America would build a two-ocean navy, fight on multiple continents, and supply allies on every front. But the greatest concentration of resources would flow toward defeating Germany. Strategic bombing of German cities and industry would begin in 1942 and intensify throughout the war. Planning for cross-channel invasion would commence immediately, though execution would wait until 1944. American troops would deploy first to North Africa in November 1942, then to Sicily and Italy in 1943, building experience before the decisive campaigns in France. The Lend-Lease pipeline expanded dramatically. From March 1941 to the war's end, the United States would deliver $50.1 billion in military and economic aid to allied nations, equivalent to roughly $700 billion in 2024. Britain received $31.4 billion. The Soviet Union received $11.3 billion, including 400,000 trucks and jeeps that vastly enhanced Red Army mobility, 14,700 aircraft, and 7,006 tanks. France, China, and other allies divided the remainder. American industrial production shifted into overdrive. The War Production Board, established in January 1942, coordinated the conversion of civilian industries. The Office of War Mobilization, created in May 1943, provided final supervisory authority. Production figures climbed month by month. 1942 production: 49,000 aircraft, 32,000 tanks, 17,000 anti-aircraft guns larger than 20 millimeters. Monthly production rate for aircraft by year-end, twice Germany's rate. Combined U.S. and British production, 2.5 times all Axis Europe combined. 1943 production increased again. By autumn 1943, all Allied shipping sunk since 1939 had been replaced by new construction. American shipyards worked with assembly line precision. Liberty ships, standard cargo vessels of 10,000 tons displacement, took an average of 42 days to build. The fastest, the Robert E. Peary, was constructed in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. By 1944, American war production exceeded the combined output of all Axis nations. The United States was building 96,000 aircraft annually. Tank production reached 20,000 annually. Machine gun production topped 600,000 per year. More than half of all industrial production in the world took place in the United States. The German response was futile. Albert Speer, appointed Reich's Minister of Armaments in February 1942, implemented ambitious programs to increase German war production. He achieved impressive results. German tank production rose from 2,875 in 1941 to 5,966 in 1942 to 12,013 in 1943. Aircraft production increased from 11,776 in 1941 to 15,409 in 1942 to 25,527 in 1943. But these gains were overwhelmed by Allied output. The disparity was most visible in strategic bombing. When American heavy bombers joined the RAF in raids over Germany in 1942, Luftwaffe fighter forces initially achieved favorable exchange rates. German industrial production actually increased despite the bombing through 1943. But the tide was turning. American P-51 Mustang fighters, equipped with external fuel tanks, could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back starting in late 1943. Luftwaffe losses became unsustainable. By 1944, Allied air superiority over Europe was absolute. The Luftwaffe lost 2,260 aircraft in May 1944 alone, with no possibility of replacement at anywhere near the loss rate. When Operation Overlord began on June 6, 1944, Allied air forces flew more than 14,000 sorties on D-Day. The Luftwaffe flew 319. On the Eastern Front, Soviet counteroffensives gained momentum throughout 1943 and 1944. American trucks and locomotives kept Soviet armies supplied. American food, spam, canned goods, grain fed Soviet workers and soldiers. American aviation fuel powered Soviet aircraft. Stalin himself acknowledged in a 1943 toast that without American production, the United Nations could never have won the war. The strategic consequences of Hitler's December 11 decision cascaded through every subsequent campaign. The North African landings in November 1942, Operation Torch, deployed 107,000 American and British troops with American industrial power providing the bulk of equipment. When Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered in May 1943, 275,000 German and Italian soldiers entered captivity. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 and mainland Italy in September 1943 further stretched German resources. Each new front required German troops, German weapons, German logistics, all drawing resources from the desperate defense against Soviet offensives in the East. The combined bomber offensive systematically destroyed German industrial capacity. By 1944, German transportation networks were collapsing. Fuel production dropped catastrophically. Synthetic fuel plants were priority targets. German fighter pilots in the final year of war often flew missions with barely enough fuel to reach combat areas, none for extended engagements. The statistics of attrition were remorseless. From January 1942 through May 1945,
The United States produced 324,750 aircraft. Germany produced 119,307. The United States produced 88,400 tanks. Germany produced 34,069. The United States produced 2,382,311 trucks. Germany produced 345,914. The disparity was not merely quantitative, but qualitative. American equipment improved consistently throughout the war, while German equipment, though often technically sophisticated, suffered from supply constraints and manufacturing bottlenecks. By early 1945, the consequences of Hitler's December 11, 1941, were visible in every corner of the shrinking Reich. German cities lay in ruins. Industrial production had collapsed. The Wehrmacht faced simultaneous offensives from east and west by armies equipped with overwhelming material superiority. The Luftwaffe was grounded for lack of fuel. The Kriegsmarine had been swept from the seas. German military leaders had recognized the catastrophic error almost immediately. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the Armed Forces High Command, later testified at Nuremberg that he had opposed the declaration. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel admitted he had considered it strategically unsound. But Hitler's decision was final, and the German military apparatus implemented it without further protest. The human cost was staggering. From December 1941 through May 1945, approximately 3.5 million German military personnel died. Civilian casualties from Allied bombing exceeded 400,000. The Eastern Front consumed the majority of German combat deaths, but American involvement ensured Germany faced strategic bombing, invasion from the West, and material aid to the Soviet Union that made German defeat inevitable and accelerated. Hitler's declaration of war guaranteed the Holocaust would be conducted under conditions of total war against a coalition possessing overwhelming industrial superiority. The systematic murder of European Jewry proceeded with greater urgency and brutality after December 1941. The Wannsee Conference, where Nazi officials coordinated implementation of the final solution, took place on January 20, 1942, barely 6 weeks after Hitler's declaration.
The strategic balance sheet of December 11, 1941, reveals the magnitude of Hitler's miscalculation in stark numerical terms. German military production 1942 to 1945. Total aircraft 119,307. Total tanks and self-propelled guns 34,069. Total military trucks 345,914. Peak monthly aircraft production 3,538 September 1944. Total military personnel mobilized approximately 18 million. American military production 1942 to 1945. Total aircraft 324,750. Total tanks and self-propelled guns 88,410. Total military trucks 2,382,111. Peak monthly aircraft production 9,113 March 1944. Total military personnel mobilized 16.1 million. Combined Allied production U.S., Britain, USSR 1942 to 1945. Total aircraft approximately 633,072. Total tanks approximately 227,235. Total military trucks approximately 3,060,000. The disparity extended beyond production numbers. American industrial processes were more efficient. American factories operated with superior mechanization. American supply chains were undisrupted by bombing. American workers were adequately fed and housed. American raw materials were abundant and accessible.
Germany's situation deteriorated progressively. Albert Speer's production increases in 1943 and early 1944 represented maximum effort under increasingly constrained circumstances. By late 1944, German synthetic fuel production, critical for aviation and armored operations, had been reduced to 15% of capacity by Allied bombing. Transportation networks were collapsing. Raw material shortages forced compromises in quality. Experienced workers were conscripted for military service and replaced by forced labor with lower productivity. The strategic bombing campaign's effects were cumulative. The U.S. 8th Air Force, based in Britain, and the 15th Air Force, based in Italy, flew daylight precision raids against industrial targets. RAF Bomber Command flew nighttime area raids against cities. From January 1943 through May 1945, Allied air forces dropped 2,770,000 tons of bombs on Europe, with 1,360,000 falling on Germany itself. German fighter production actually increased under this assault, from 10,898 in 1943 to 25,285 in 1944. But pilot training collapsed. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons. Experienced pilots were killed faster than replacements could be trained. By 1945, many German pilots had fewer than 30 hours of flight time when they entered combat. American and British pilots typically had 400 hours. The final campaigns demonstrated the cumulative effect. When Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, German defenders lacked fuel, ammunition, air support, and adequate replacements. Entire divisions existed only on paper. The Ruhr pocket, surrounded in April 1945, yielded 325,000 German prisoners, more than surrendered at Stalingrad. Total German military casualties from all causes 1941 to 1945 exceeded 5,300,000 dead and 10 million wounded or captured. American casualties in the European theater totaled approximately 185,000 killed and 550,000 wounded. Tragic losses, but representing a fraction of German casualties and far fewer than would have occurred had America fought a prolonged Pacific-only war while Germany consolidated control of Europe. Soviet casualties dwarfed all others. 8.7 million military deaths, 10.6 million civilian deaths directly attributable to military operations, and additional millions from indirect causes. But American Lend-Lease supplies materially contributed to Soviet victories. Nikita Khrushchev later stated, "If the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war." The comparative survival rates tell their own story. American industrial capacity, logistical sophistication, and emphasis on force protection resulted in casualty rates far below Axis equivalents. The U.S. military maintained a tooth-to-tail ratio that prioritized supply, maintenance, and medical care. For every American combat soldier, 7 support personnel ensured he was fed, equipped, supplied, and evacuated if wounded. This approach seemed inefficient to German military theorists who emphasized maximum combat strength, but it proved strategically superior in a war of industrial attrition. Winston Churchill summarized the transformation succinctly in his Memoirs. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States was his greatest strategic error. It turned a difficult situation for Britain into one where victory became certain. George F. Kennan, reflecting decades later on his experience as a diplomat in Berlin on December 11, 1941, described Hitler's decision as inexplicable except as an act of pure hubris. Kennan noted that German diplomats in the foreign ministry had expressed bewilderment. They understood the strategic implications.
They recognized that Germany was adding a superpower enemy while failing to defeat existing opponents. But Hitler's decision was absolute. December 11, 1941. Foreign Ministry, Wilhelmstrasse, Berlin, 2:45 p.m. Leland Morris walked out of Ribbentrop's office carrying the document that would reshape the world. The paper itself was unremarkable. Standard German diplomatic stationery, crisp black typeface, official seals. But the words on that paper guaranteed Nazi Germany's defeat as certainly as any military campaign. The declaration reached Washington by cable within hours. President Roosevelt had the war authorization he needed. Congress voted unanimously. Within 4 years, American industrial might, the arsenal of democracy, would help reduce Nazi Germany to rubble and occupation. The aircraft that bombed German cities were American-built. The trucks that carried Soviet armies to Berlin were American-built. The ships that delivered millions of tons of supplies across hostile oceans were American-built. The industrial capacity Hitler dismissed as devoted to refrigerators and automobiles produced more weapons in 4 years than Germany produced in 12. Hitler's December 11th speech at the Kroll Opera House lasted 90 minutes. He blamed Roosevelt, blamed the Jews, blamed international capitalism, blamed everyone except German strategic miscalculation. He promised victory. He threatened annihilation of his enemies. He spoke with absolute conviction that Germany's triumph was inevitable. He was wrong about everything. The irony is almost unbearable. Hitler declared war believing he was being decisive, seizing initiative, demonstrating strength to the Japanese ally and the German people. Roosevelt couldn't get Congress to declare war on Germany. American isolationism remained powerful. Germany had no treaty obligation to support Japan's attack. Hitler could have forced America into a Pacific-only conflict. Instead, he handed Roosevelt the greatest political gift imaginable. The isolationists were silenced overnight. The America First Committee disbanded within hours. Congress voted 393 to declare war on Germany. The full weight of American economic and military power would be directed against Nazi Germany. Historians Brendan Sims and Charlie Laderman argue that December 11, 1941 was more strategically significant than December 7. Pearl Harbor brought America into war with Japan. Hitler's declaration created the global coalition that guaranteed Axis defeat. It was Hitler's declaration of war on the United States, much more than Pearl Harbor, that created a new global strategic reality. Klaus P. Fischer's assessment is harsher. December 11, 1941 marked the moment Hitler crossed the line separating a brutal dictator from a mass murderer. The declaration removed final constraints on the Holocaust. It guaranteed Germany would face overwhelming force. It ensured the Nazi regime would be destroyed utterly. John Kenneth Galbraith's indescribable feeling of triumph upon hearing the news was justified. Winston Churchill's relief, the sleep of the saved and thankful, was warranted. Both men understood immediately what Hitler had done. He had lost the war. Not lost a battle, not suffered a setback, lost the war itself. On December 11, 1941, Nazi Germany's defeat became inevitable. The only questions remaining were how long it would take and how many would die in the interim. The mathematics were brutally simple. Germany controlled a population of roughly 170 million in December 1941, but much of that population was hostile occupied territory. American population was 132 million. But American industrial capacity was triple Germany's. American resources were vastly greater. American territory was untouchable by German forces. And America could trade freely with the rest of the world. Add British resources, Commonwealth forces, and Soviet manpower, and the disparity became overwhelming. Hitler's fundamental miscalculation was believing that will and racial ideology could overcome industrial capacity. He was wrong.
In total war between industrial powers, the side with greater production wins. American industry outproduced Germany 3-1 in aircraft, 2.5-1 in tanks, nearly 7-1 in trucks. When America's production combined with British and Soviet output, the Axis faced impossible odds. Hitler's fundamental miscalculation was believing that will and racial ideology could overcome industrial capacity. He was wrong. In total war between industrial powers, the side with greater production wins. American industry outproduced Germany 3-1 in aircraft, 2.5-1 in tanks, nearly 7-1 in trucks. When America's production combined with British and Soviet output, the Axis faced impossible odds. The examination of diplomatic cables, congressional records, and the memoirs of those who witnessed December 11, 1941, reveals a single inescapable conclusion. Adolf Hitler's declaration of war against the United States represents the most consequential strategic blunder in military history. He had no obligation to declare war. He gained no military advantage by declaring war. He solved his enemy's greatest political problem by declaring war. And he guaranteed his own regime's destruction by declaring war.
The document Ribbentrop handed to Leland Morris that December afternoon in Berlin was more than a declaration of war. It was Germany's suicide note. Hitler thought he was demonstrating strength and decisiveness. He was demonstrating catastrophic misjudgment and strategic incompetence. Sometimes the enemy's greatest weapon is your own fatal miscalculation. And in that single fact lies the entire story of why Nazi Germany lost the Second World War.